Hello BookTube, it's Mike from Riffraff's Reading Renaissance, and today is Shaketember Act 2. I wanted to start this video with the line, "How do I love thee, Shaketember? Let me count the ways." And then I was reminded that that's a line from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's 43rd sonnet, not William Shakespeare's. Other than that, it was a good idea. So anyway, here we are, Act 2 of Shaketember. So let's regroup. I recently posted Act 1, in which we looked at the complete plays of Shakespeare, 3 biographies, several retellings, a documentary on BBC about In Search of Shakespeare. We looked at the South African context of both apartheid and the culture of African storytelling, and we looked at 3 feminist takes on William Shakespeare. And today I want to take it a little bit further, because I've had a little bit more time to actually go into some of the books we looked at, and I'd like to feedback. The first thing I did was I referenced back to this book that I talked about last time, about In Search of Shakespeare. And I mentioned last time that it was in fact a companion book to a BBC documentary, a 4-part documentary. I've now watched the documentary, and I have to say I must recommend it very, very strongly. It's an absolutely fantastic exercise in finding out more about Shakespeare and his time. The narrator who walks us through the journey is Michael Wood, and he's fantastic. His enthusiasm for Shakespeare is utterly infectious. He starts the documentary by arguing, how can the life of a writer be as interesting or exciting as that of a conqueror or an inventor or an explorer? And he emphatically argues that it is.
Well, yes, it can. More so, because the writers and the poets are the explorers of the human heart, and long after the conquerors are forgotten, their legacy will be the most valuable to us.
He carries that enthusiasm with him through the 4-part documentary series, and I cannot recommend it strongly enough. I'm sure it's available on all the streaming services, but I would strongly advise you not only to get the book, because it's a fantastic book, and as you page through it, I've made a few little marks here. There's a portrait of what we think is a young William Shakespeare. A common theme running through tonight's video will be how little we actually know factually about William Shakespeare, but that is felt to probably be a young man's portrait of Shakespeare. And of course, this one is a much better known portrait of, presumably of Shakespeare, later in life. But even that, there's no genuine confirmation that that's actually him, although it does seem likely. So, a shrouded man of mystery, Mr. Shakespeare. But the documentary and the book paint a wonderful context of Shakespeare's life and times, and explains where all these characters we've heard of fit in around the story of Shakespeare, be it Queen Elizabeth, Francis Drake, Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, even Guy Fawkes has an appearance there with the gunpowder plot, and the whole move from late Elizabethan period to the earlier Jacobean period, and how the political intrigue of that transition period reflected ultimately in the play of Macbeth. Quite striking from the documentary is the level of vicious brutality of the rivalry between the Protestants and the Catholics. Perhaps that hadn't been as clear to me before watching this as it was in a country that underwent 3 changes of official state religion in the space of 12 years. Another very poignant moment in the story is when Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, finally achieves his life's ambition of getting the Shakespeare family registered with its own coat of arms, which was a sort of social status achievement. And this happened literally at the same time that Shakespeare lost his 11-year-old son, and therefore the official line of Shakespeare would not live to benefit from all the effort they put into getting a lineage of the coat of arms, which was a big deal at the time. Shakespeare references the loss of his son in the 33rd sonnet, where he says, "Even so, my son," he spells son S-U-N, but I think the implication is clear, and the double meaning of son is quite clever. "Even so, my son, one early morn did shine, with all triumphant splendour on my brow. But out, alack, he was but 1 hour mine, The region cloud have masked him for me now. Even Erasmus's In Praise of Folly gets a look in, and it's attributed to where Shakespeare got the idea of the fool that he uses in multiple plays, but particularly in King Lear, as a mechanism for deconstructing people of power. Another interesting aspect that comes out of the documentary is the whole story about the Dark Lady. It's said that several of Shakespeare's sonnets were in fact written to a dark lady, which was quite a thing in England at the time. It identifies who it believes that dark lady was, one Emilia Lanier, who was part of a large London music family, dark-skinned Venetian Jews, and hence the suggestions of the influences that may have led to The Merchant of Venice. We also see, very interestingly, some of the lost Shakespeare plays. Although the books we all have on our shelves are called complete, they're not actually complete because some have been lost. There's a reference to Love's Labour's Won. That's not a misprint. We all know Love's Labour's Lost, but apparently there's one called Love's Labour's Won, which is lost to the midst of time, and another one called Cardenio, which had the first time introducing music into the plays after Shakespeare had had a visit to Italy. Ultimately, the documentary rounds up with one of Shakespeare's rivals but friends, Ben Jonson, who said of him that he eclipsed even greatest poets of ancient Greece and Rome. He was not of an age, but for all time. I think that's fairly well established by now, given that we're sitting here many hundreds of years later, and the lure and lore of Shakespeare has not diminished in any respect whatsoever. In Act 1, I said I wanted to read Bill Bryson's biography of Shakespeare because it was a sort of a shorty September length of book rather than Peter Ackroyd's rather more magnificent tome, which might not have fitted into my reading schedule. And I did in fact read Bill Bryson's book. It's splendid. It was written as part of a series where short books were being written to summarize some of the great writers. And I learnt a lot. There's a lot of interesting facts, despite the fact that Bill Bryson rather humbly starts by emphasizing quite how little there is in terms of factual evidence about Shakespeare and his life. We know very little about him, but a lot of work has been done around that to try and piece together as much of the information as we can, and a little bit of intuitism and putting two and two together get us quite a reasonable picture of Shakespeare and his time. I learnt, for example, that the theatres of the time were placed outside the jurisdiction of the city in order to not be restrained by some of the tighter, more prurient rules of the city, along with other institutions like brothels, prisons, gunpowder stores, graveyards, and lunatic asylums. So that's the company in which Will and his players operated. I also discovered, very interestingly, that a critic called Green wrote a document called Green's Groat's Worth of Wit, in which he described William Shakespeare as an upstart crow. And that I found fascinating because I had not known until now why the BBC comedy series starring David Mitchell as William Shakespeare is called Upstart Crow. Now I know. Amazing what reading can do for you. There also, in the book, he makes the point that Shakespeare's writings are characterized by a positive and palpable appreciation of the transfixing power of language. Let me find a reference point that I marked in the book to read to you to make that point. He says, he makes the point that nearly every play has at least one or two lines that defeat interpretation, like these from Love's Labour's Lost. O paradox, black is the badge of hell, the hue of dungeons, and the school of night. What exactly he meant by the school of night is really anyone's guess. The most ambiguous example of all, surely, is the line in King Lear that appeared originally as Swithold footed thrice the old, and knell through night more and her ninefold. So there's a bit of a stretch there, and I think that sometimes Shakespeare was playing with language rather than worrying too much about whether all of his allusions made absolute sense. That's a bit of that's Bryson's theory in any event. He also explains that Shakespeare gave us over 1,700 new words to the English language and even more phrases that we use every day. He gives examples like one fell swoop, vanish into thin air, playing fast and loose, foul play, remembrance of things past, cold comfort, to thine own self be true. And he uses an example where Shakespeare actually works two into one sentence, where he says in Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 4, he says, though I am native here and to the manor born, it is a custom more honoured in the breach than the observance. This is Shakespeare, or Hamlet, disapproving of the Danish drinking habit. We mentioned that William Shakespeare lost his only son Hamnet in 1596, and he wrote, grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me. Very powerful. And there's a reference, of course, to the more recent novel by Magie O'Farrell called Hamnet, in which one can read a lot more about that story. I haven't yet read Hamlet, so I won't comment further on it, but I'm sure I hear it's a very well-written and well-received novel. We also learnt that Sonnet 18, the very famous Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, was not in fact written to some beautiful woman who had taken Shakespeare's eye, but to a man. In fact, all of sonnets number 1 through 126 were written for what was called a beauteous young man, and in fact sonnets 127 to 154 are dedicated to a dark lady. Scandalous. Picking up on the idea of the dark lady, in Act 1 I referenced a poem that talked about my lover's eyes are nothing like the sun, and I linked it to the Anthony Burgess novel Nothing Like the Sun. I've now read this novel, which I've been meaning to do for a long time, so thank you ShakeTimber for kicking me into action. And if you look closely at the cover of it, you will see that there's Master Shakespeare, and the lady standing next to him is clearly a dark lady. And this book, which is absolutely brilliant, as only Anthony Burgess can be, is a fictional version of the William Shakespeare story, particularly focused on his love life. Harold Bloom, and we in Act 1, we referenced Harold Bloom's authoritative book on Shakespeare, but Harold Bloom's comment on this book is he said this is Anthony Burgess's best novel. Now that's a bold claim. There's a lot of other Anthony Burgess novels which would stick their hands up to be considered, but that's what Harold Bloom thought, and he knew quite a lot about Shakespeare. It's brilliantly written. It's cleverly written in a Shakespearean style. There's Elizabethan idioms and even Joycean wordplay, which ends up, as a reader, you feel delightfully immersed in Shakespeare's world. It's very, very clever. I will say that Burgess's writing is it's fantastic, but it's also his command of vocabulary is vast. And I have to say, at this point, I should share with you a trick I've learned in my reading habits. I've downloaded the Oxford English Dictionary as an app on my phone, and I would strongly recommend to anybody to do that so that you have it with you at all times. There are certain books, and this is one of them, that just elevate the level of English language usage above the sort of everyday. This book had me stopping every now and then and consulting the app to discover and to confirm for myself the meaning of such words as cursy, cotomancy, crapulous, which doesn't mean what you think, simulacrum, phantasmagoria, manumission, imminent, not imminent, which means soon, but imminent, which means interior, porphyry, spirocheate, and epiphenomenon. So it's a bit of a stretch, but this is the beauty of the book. It does the same thing with language that Shakespeare likes to do while telling the story of Shakespeare's life, albeit fictionalized. It's less about Shakespeare as the universal genius and much more about him as a deeply human man of flesh and of frailty, a man of lust, a man of creativity, and it explores the roots of his artistic genius and the fact that it argues that a lot of his output and genius came from not necessarily comfortable situations in his own life. It does explore the fact that, as I said before, 2/3 of his sonnets were written to a man and the other third written to a dark lady who is identified in this book as Fatima, so there's more than one theory out there. Albeit in a fictional form, it resolves the conundrum we've addressed before about Shakespeare leaving his wife his second best bed. I'm not going to tell you any more about that because it would be a spoiler. I do urge you to read this book if you haven't. It's not long at all. It's 210 odd pages. But if you like Shakespeare and you like Burgess, this is a no-brainer, and I'm glad I read it. I discovered as well that Anthony Burgess, with his love for Shakespeare, went further than just writing a fictional novel. The novel, of course, is speculative and imaginative and bawdy, but he also wrote a biography simply called Shakespeare, and that's knowledgeable and affectionate. I haven't read it, but I have ordered it because I am a big Burgess fan and I'm a big Shakespeare fan, so it was a piece of the puzzle that I need to fill in my reading Renaissance journey. I think the last word I'll say on Anthony Burgess, and this really perhaps explains why I like his writing, he says, "The wresting of beauty out of language is the only thing in the world that matters." I think that's a lovely thing for a writer to have said. So, the ways of experiencing Shakespeare, as we've discovered in our 2-act exercise of Shaketember, are endless. I made another discovery that in 2013, Random House Publishers launched what they called the Hogarth Shakespeare series, in which they took a whole range of novelists and asked them to retell the Shakespeare stories in not new novels. Margaret Atwood retold The Tempest. Tracy Chevalier, whose novel I recently read, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which was fantastic, she did a retelling of Othello. Gillian Flynn, who's famous for The Girl on the Train, was commissioned to retell Hamlet, which she appears to have failed to deliver. I don't know more about that story or why. But then the one that intrigued me most was Joan Nesbo, who is a very successful crime writer, retold the story of Macbeth. And that I do actually have to hand. This is Joan Nesbo's Macbeth. Now, Macbeth, if I'm honest, is my favorite of Shakespeare's plays, perhaps because it's one of the first I saw live. But this book by Nesbo was very well received by the critics. It tells the story of Inspector Macbeth in a dystopian imaginary fief in Scotland during the 1970s. Inspector Macbeth leads a SWAT team. He reports to Police Commissioner Duncan, and his mentor is a guy called Banquo. He meets up with 3 drug smugglers who make predictions about his future rise in the ranks of the police force. And his significant other is called simply Lady. Get it? Lady Macbeth. And so the bloody path of ambition leads on. I haven't read the book yet. I intend to, but it sounds a fantastic derivation of the Shakespeare Macbeth story. And finally, I alluded to it briefly before, but I've also taken time this month to rewatch David Mitchell's brilliant BBC series called Upstart Crow, which tells the life of Shakespeare's domestic existence in a comedy form.
I hardly think that centuries hence a tiny clique of Oxbridge posh boys will still be running everything.
It's absolutely brilliant. Anyone who likes comedy, Shakespeare, the BBC, or David Mitchell is highly recommended to track it down and have a look. So, in summary then, Act 1, as I said, we looked at the complete plays. We looked at ways of accessing them through simpler retellings. We looked at some of the South African context of trying to make them accessible and realistic to new listeners and people experiencing Shakespeare for the first time. We looked at some feminist takes on Shakespeare. And tonight I've tried to look at the documentary and the book, which have impressed me tremendously and strongly recommended. Bill Bryson's wonderful biography. We've touched on Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet novel. We've indulged heavily in Burgess's novel and become aware of his biography, which needs to follow up. I've also acquired Nesbo's Macbeth, which is exciting, and I've watched Upstart Crow. So I've just found endless ways to enjoy the Bard, and I hope you have too. I hope some of what I've shared with you will inspire you to take more time to enjoy William Shakespeare. And I want to thank the hosts who've initiated Shaketember. It's a wonderful idea. I've had fantastic experience just delving into all aspects of the Bard. As always, if you enjoy what I'm doing, please do the like and subscribe stuff. And particularly if you like it a lot, mark the bit that tells you immediately when I release stuff. That's very helpful. And thank you so much for staying with me on the journey. And until next time, bye-bye now.